thought actually it would be interesting to look at travel over the length of my life. I was in the mood for looking back. So I'm going to read you 3 short extracts which reflect the role that travel has played in my life. The first is an extract from a memoir which I wrote about 10 years ago, and it's reflecting on my relatively sheltered upbringing. We didn't go on holidays as a family abroad until I was 18. And then I thought I'd read an extract reflecting my own life. So I married a soldier, so we were constantly on the move, and we've lived in Germany, Northern Ireland, Hong Kong, as well as various locations in the UK. And the piece I'm going to read refers to when we first moved to Kingston in 1994, and it comes from a blog I wrote earlier this summer. And then finally, I wanted to reflect the experience of the next generation, for whom long-distance travel and gap years was a permanent fixture of their life, perhaps influenced by the upbringing they'd had. And I'm going to read something written by our son, our eldest son, who's also a Kingston graduate. Okay, so this is from my father and me. By the time I was 14, I had set foot in every county in England and Wales and half of Scotland. And although this was sometimes literally the case, I remember my father stopping the car so we could all get out and put our feet down in Rutland, which was then the smallest county. Usually we moved on with a working knowledge of the place. And this at a time when most people seemed to return to the same place year after year. My father saw holidays basically as an exercise in ticking places off. Some locations he'd been posted to on his army training, some he'd read about in his childhood encyclopedia. Others were places that friends or relatives had mentioned as being attractive. My mother was allowed no part in planning these excursions, and they certainly didn't line up with her preferences, as her choices proved once he died. And of course, in those days, no one even thought of consulting the children. What is more, these plans existed for years into the future. My brother and I lived with the promise of one year hiring a dormobile and going up to Scotland. Our arguments about who would sleep in the pitched-roof bedroom on top were polished in our minds for years. This desire for complete coverage of the United Kingdom led to some very strange excursions. Places were chosen for their accessibility to a range of things you wanted to visit, and so were often nodal without being noted holiday destinations, which meant that the things that we might wanted to have bought or done were not available. One year we went to Berwick-on-Tweed. No beach, nothing much to look at, and we then moved on to Grange-over-Sands. We seemed to be the only young family there, the guest house being full of pensioners, and the sands were an expanse of tidal territory that was washed in 2 directions, making it too hazardous to walk on, let alone swim on. On the way there and back, we stayed in bed and breakfast accommodation. This was not appealing. Bed and breakfast landladies tend not to like children. They can't charge as much and they make a mess. We were no exception. My brother acquired a penknife in Grange-over-Sands, and then, of course, cut himself with it. What he could have avoided doing was then bleeding all over the dressing table stool, which was upholstered in gold brocade, the bright red contrasting effectively with shiny material. My parents later claimed he had a nosebleed. Wherever we were headed, once installed in our holiday location, we would work our way through the guidebook. No National Trust or English Heritage treasure would be left unvisited, and this was long before the days of sympathetic quiz sheets for accompanying children. We marched along behind our parents, looking at what we were asked to look at and not asking for souvenirs from the shop. Ice creams were bought at regular intervals and according to a strict hierarchy. Mother could have a heart, a shilling, and we could have anything up to a top 10, 10p. My father invariably had a creamy lolly, which cost 4p. On one occasion, I remember my father allowing us a free choice from the menu. The lady running the kiosk said our choice was far too much for a child, and we were relegated to the lower half of the price list again. The more of the planned locations we could fit in, the better my father's mood, from specific views across estuaries to particular tea shops that he patronised in the 1950s. We sat in the car in the pouring rain in Rothsay, as he walked up and down the main street, trying to work out where was the cafe he had visited with his friends during his basic army training. The moments he was reliving always had to do with his life as a single man rather than his life since. And whereas he would talk with great animation about what had happened during his cycling holidays with his friends, the retold moments that came out of our joint adventures tended to be complaints or regrets for missed opportunities. He was furious when my brother left his shoes at the causeway opposite Holy Island, which meant we had to return to hunt for them the next day, rather than progressing to his next scheduled destination. The world seemed to be full of things that he had always planned to see, but which we somehow kept him from. This is from a blog I wrote this summer. Standing in the playground, waiting for our eldest son to start his first day at school, another parent turned to me. "You're new," she said helpfully. It was true, we had moved in a week before, just before Christmas, so he'd missed his whole first term. In Germany, from where we'd just come, children didn't start school until the term in which they were 5, so he'd missed all the preparation and did not even know which school he was going to until they'd already broken up for the holidays. But he was fully equipped with the right uniform, including the mysterious folding material that resulted in a chair bag, which I'd managed to make in time for today. And what's more, I'd managed to get him, his 2-year-old sister, and a clearly visible bum, all ready for this new start. "Where do you live?" she continued. I gestured to the army estate just behind the school. "Well, you won't be here long then, will you?" she said, and turned away. It was my first experience of what was to become a constant, given that we went on to have 4 children, issue for the next 20 years. How to get your services family integrated within a community that was content without you, which had seen many new faces come and go, and was disinclined to distinguish between them. In some areas, where competition for school places was particularly tight, the local residents were moving house in order to secure a place. A services child could find their arrival greeted with particular antagonism. Stories circulated about whether it was wise to own up to your military status. Civilian parents sometimes warned their children not to make friends with a services child because they would have their heart broken when they moved on. Our solutions were varied. We always tried to get each child to invite someone home for tea quickly, while we found non-services children were fascinated to enter another world, where bikes could be left outside the front door in the sure knowledge that they would not be taken, and where a community of children ran in and out of each other's homes. At school we would volunteer, other parents admitting that the get-involved mentality of the services benefited the school, that services fathers could be relied upon to contribute to the community, turn up, and, particularly if they were from an engineer or ordnance unit, build things. But still the levels of differentness were felt. I remember a particularly painful incident at a primary school open meeting when discussion turned to the rising school roll, and one parent stood and raised the difficulty of accommodating all these itinerant service children. Services children themselves have much to offer. Those studying the outcomes of education and the likely needs of future employers talk about the need for individual resilience, self-determination and personal motivation, the kinds of personality trait developed through the ability to manage change. Maybe children with completely geographically stable childhoods can benefit from seeing how others of the same age manage the big disruptions that are routine to the services child. A son who started that January went on to study English and drama at university. He had a gap year beforehand, 3 gap summers afterwards, and then embarked on an MA in magazine journalism here and a career as a travel writer. finally I'm going to read something written by him. It's called Venezuela's Nightly Lightning Show. Venezuela's Lake Maracaibo sees more lightning than anywhere else on Earth. Our writer gets a ringside seat to watch the action. And this appeared in The Guardian. It had over 3,000 shares and 27 comments, and it appeared in March 2015. Anyone who cowers under the duvet during a thunderstorm should look away now. But those who love the theatre and the excitement of a good bout of thunder and lightning should consider visiting one spot in South America if they ever pass that way. South America's largest body of water, Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, is the site of the most frequent lightning in the world, according to Graham Anderson, an expert on the subject at the Met Office. The heat and humidity are at optimum levels here, and with the addition of wind caused by the surrounding Andes, the lightning is the most intense and predictable in the world. Spectacular storms are a crowd pleaser, and apparently something people are prepared to pay to see. Lakeside fishing communities now welcome tourists who come on special trips from Merida, a lively Andean town in the northwest of the country. I joined them on a tour led by Alan Heighton, a pioneer of trips that make the most of what is called Catatumbo lightning, so called because it only occurs over the mouth of the eponymous river that flows into the lake. Towering storm clouds were already visible on the horizon as my group drove from the frosty Andean peaks down to the desert and then tropical rainforest. At the head of an inlet, speedboats waited to whisk us out onto the lake. The jungle around teemed with life, and we could hear the shriek of howler monkeys, the world's loudest terrestrial animal. Before we emerged, under massive skies, on the lake, an expanse of over 5,000 square miles. Storm clouds were brewing in the distance. The soft rolling of their thunder reached us as we powered onwards to Ologa, the lakeside fishing community where we were to stay. In the evening, we met the local community, most of whom have been pleasantly surprised by the growth of interest in thunderstorm tourism. It's nothing unusual for us, so it's funny that people come to watch what I see from my hammock every evening, said Daniel Bracco, a smiling 16-year-old charged with keeping the village's electricity generator running on government-subsidised petrol. Night falls quickly this close to the equator, and soon we were absorbed in stargazing. Meanwhile, the lightning show was tuning up in the far distance, ready to burst onto the stage in the small hours. The low growling thunder grew louder, setting the scene for the opening act of a major storm far across the lake, electrifying the horizon. The palm-dwelling monkeys retreated into denser bush as the atmosphere began to sway their treetop dwellings, and we carried our chairs to where we might better witness the action. Suddenly, the first enormous bolt leapt to earth, followed by a roar of thunder that reverberated through the foliage. Backlit by sheet lightning, gigantic storm clouds swirled high into the tropical night air, obscuring the star-strewn skies to the east. Then forks of lightning exploded in all directions, the larger ones burning their impressions onto our retinas, so that closing my eyes following the strike, I could review the bolt's jagged form as it had powered through the atmosphere back to Earth. Flat-bottom clouds sent their bright white roots down into the ground. The more localized storms began to contribute to the show. Eventually, the lightning strikes became uncountable. The world had become an enormous strobe light. It was as bright as daylight. We no longer needed coffee to keep us attentive, even in the small hours. Eventually, dawn crept across the expanse of water before us, and the storm slowed. Exhausted by nature's astonishing show, we crawled back to our hammocks and dropped off almost immediately, coaxed to sleep by the echoes of nature's thunderous lullaby. And the fishermen, starting work early to avoid the intense midday heat, began their speedboat commutes out onto the water, silhouetted against the brightening eastern skies.
And I'm very proud to say that this piece has just been chosen by the Cambridge board as an examination text.